So a couple of people emailed me and asked me what I thought about the drug problem in the United States and if I would shoot a video that addresses that issue. I think the best place to begin is to consider what general semantics would say about the drug problem. General semantics is a kind of applied epistemology or a science of evaluation that tries to become aware of the way that people react, perhaps without even realizing it, to situations, to the larger world, to elements in the world in particular, and to language. The beginning of the problem is that drugs and problem are both words, and they're very abstract words at that. There are so many different kinds of drugs. There are over-counter drugs, there are prescription drugs, there are I think things that we don't even think of as drugs. If people go and they have some soda or if they have a coffee, they may not even realize that they're using a drug. If they have a chocolate candy bar, they may not think, oh, I just enjoyed a drug. We'd want to be very careful about what are the particular drugs that we're talking about. So one of the ways that a general semanticist would try to address this is it's very difficult to speak about drugs in the abstract. You'd always want to talk about the particular drug. Part of the problem with different drugs is the various kinds of effects. There's insurance costs, there are physical effects, there are psychological effects. What do we mean by the problem? Is it law enforcement? Is the criminality of the drug a sort of prohibition effect where the law enforcement is in some cases more the problem than the drug? Yeah, some of the effects are going to be simple economics. The fact is that the pharmaceutical industries, the alcohol and tobacco industries, they have a vested interest in keeping certain kinds of drugs away from people, and they certainly have a vested interest in keeping objective information about drugs available to people. I mean, what if people were to find out that some of the drugs that are available to them are dangerous, whereas some of the drugs that right now are illegal are actually safer to use, but the only reason that people don't use them is because they're illegal? Or you have to be adamantly anti-drug in order to make sure that people know that you're not sort of talking about drugs. It's funny, Andrew Weil, he was the director of Harvard Medical at the time, and this was a while back. He said, do you know how much we spent last year trying to study the drug problem in America, and we spent all this money on rehabilitation programs and on prison sentencing, on education programs, on the Just Say No program, on the DARE program. And he says, do you know how much money we spent last year studying people who regularly use drugs but who it doesn't negatively impact? He goes, zero. Yeah, we're not interested in that question. Now, people went, oh, what are you saying? He said, look, I'm not advocating drugs. I'm just trying to show you what we're interested in and what we're not interested in. We don't seem to be interested in that question. And that itself tells you something about the drug problem. If you talk about drugs, people think you're advocating the drugs. I'm not in any way advocating drugs. In some way, it's odd to even think about either advocating for or against drugs. Drugs are just all around us. They're through and through the culture. They're what we ingest every day. I mean, I had a cup of coffee this morning. I very well likely am going to have a piece of chocolate later. I mean, what's so interesting about it is that people seem to react as if you can just talk about drugs, as if you can just have some sense of drugs being good or bad in the abstract. Is there really this thing called a drug? I don't think there is. It's in the same way that you could say there is such a thing as a person, but there's not. There's this particular person, and if you say a person, it would have to be a tall person or a short person. It would have to be a person who has a certain size of shoe. It would have to be a person who has a certain color of eyes, and they would have to have a certain shape of a nose, and they'd have to have either slopey ears or sort of short ears or long ears, or they'd have to have a certain number of teeth. There is no such thing as a person in general, in the same way that when people hear talk about drugs, and we seem to be making sense to ourselves. We think that we're able to make sense to ourselves as we talk about something like a drug or drugs, and yet we're not. Because without knowing what the particular drugs are, it's funny that even in the context when Weil was bringing this up, it's like the context itself was as if when we talk about drugs and we talk about problems, we all know what we mean. We all just know that it's these illicit street drugs. I think that partly is, it's understood, yes, that is the context in which a lot of that's what people mean. But that's such a misunderstanding of what a lot of all of that is about. It's too abstract. The discussion itself is too abstract. I think different kinds of people have different kinds of problems with different kinds of drugs. This is part of what Wheel was addressing when he suggests that there is a setting, and then the drug. There is an effect that is, quotes, in the drug, and it has an effect on the nervous system and has an effect upon the body, but it also is, there is a set of that person, and it has to do with that person's background, their mood, the situation that they're in, and then there's the setting, the actual physical environment that they're in when they're doing that drug or when they're on that particular drug. People are going to need to be able to move their level of language down to particular drugs in case. I think to really be very careful about some of the particular drugs and the particular kinds of problems, and to be able to identify those, the kinds of drugs that are addictive from those kinds of drugs that are not. What are the serious health problems and the potential health risks to the particular drugs that we use, whether those drugs are over the counter, whether those drugs are prescription drugs, whether those drugs are illicit drugs that people are using. When people are using illicit drugs, the question then becomes, are the drugs' effects harmful enough to warrant the creation of a criminal element by making those drugs illegal, or will the law enforcement be more of a problem than the drugs? Moderation is the key, right? A little bit of alcohol in moderation could be okay. A little bit of coffee in moderation could be okay. A little bit of chocolate in moderation could be okay. The point, though, of this, and this is part of the issue about medicines. When we talk about medicines, medicines are a very abstract word. What that means is that almost all medicines in high doses are poisonous. So there you have it. It was a very short video. I don't think anyone can, in about 10 minutes, fully discuss all the issues that are related to the drug problem in the United States. I think that there are and will continue to be various kinds of problems associated with various kinds of drugs, but that there will be lots of different kinds of solutions that people will need to think about. Those solutions will need to take the form of everything from more drug awareness of particular kinds of drugs, more awareness of the actual physical and psychological effects of those drugs, and more willingness for people to openly and honestly talk about drugs. Thanks.